My father stole my inheritance and left me with a worthless swamp, but soon he regretted it when that swamp made me a millionaire. I never thought a photograph could weigh so much. Sitting in my cramped New Orleans apartment, I hold this worn picture of Grandpa George, and somehow it feels heavier than all my regrets combined. Louis Armstrong plays "What a Wonderful World" from my old record player, the scratchy vinyl somehow making the music more honest. It's been 5 years since I left our family farm in rural Louisiana, but tonight the memories hit different. The smell of Mom's jambalaya steaming up the kitchen windows. The earthy scent of the bayou after a summer storm. The way Grandpa George would sit on the porch and tell me stories about old Cajun legends and hidden treasures, while Zydeco music crackled through the ancient radio. Those stories kept me alive through my teenage years, especially when Dad and my brother Zach made it clear I wasn't cut from the right cloth for their ambitions. Grandpa used to say, "Life is like a beehive, Jake. Painful sometimes, but sweet if you ain't afraid." His calloused hands would strum that old guitar, playing melodies that seemed to rise from the swamp itself. I'd watch fireflies blink like earthbound stars while neighbors would two-step on our wraparound porch, drinking Mom's sweet lemonade that somehow tasted like sunshine. That farm was the only place I ever felt like myself. 30 years on this earth, and those memories are still the realest thing I own. My father, Tom, was everything Grandpa wasn't. A lawyer with a shark smile and eyes that calculated your worth before you finished introducing yourself. He wore suits even in July heat, never seemed to sweat, and talk about legacy and family name like they were currencies he was always collecting. My brother Zach inherited that same hunger. 2 years older than me. He shadowed Dad like he was studying for a master class in ambition. Both of them looked at my dreams of being a musician like I'd announced I wanted to professionally collect dirt. "You dream like your grandpa," Zach once told me while we were fixing fence posts, and he ended up with nothing but swamp tails and arthritis. When I'd play my songs at the dinner table, Dad would check his watch like I was stealing minutes from his billable hours. Only Grandpa George would tap his foot along, winking at me from across the table. Tom's so slick, he could trick the bees out of their honey, Grandpa once whispered after Dad had smoothly talked his way out a speeding ticket. That was as close to criticism as Grandpa ever got about his son. The call about Grandpa's death didn't come from family. It came from Sheriff Earl, an old fishing buddy of Grandpa's with a voice like gravel and a heart twice as big as regulation. "He went peaceful, son," Earl said. "Found him on the porch with that damn guitar still in his lap. Looked like he was just taking a nap in the sunshine. I should have known something was off when neither Dad nor Zach had bothered to call me themselves." The funeral was Louisiana in a nutshell, heavy with humidity and unspoken family tension. The small chapel smelled of too many lilies and not enough air. Dad stood stoic in a black suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, while Zach worked the room like he was campaigning for office. I watched from the back as Dad huddled with some slick-haired man in an expensive suit, their heads bent together like conspirators. Zach kept flashing a new watch that caught the light whenever he gesticulated, which was often and dramatic. Sheriff Earl found me by the coffee station, his uniform crisp despite the heat. "Your grandpa talked about you all the time, Jake," he said, pouring a cup of coffee so black it looked like swamp water. "Said you were the only one who listened. Said he was leaving you something special." Earl's eyes flicked toward my father and back to me. "Watch out for Tom, little buddy. Your grandpa and I had a conversation last month about some concerns." Before I could ask what concerns, Dad announced it was time for family to gather at the house. The family dining room felt suffocating that evening. Mom's pecan pie sat untouched at the center of the table, its sweet aroma mixing with the tension. Dad cleared his throat, straightening papers like he was in a boardroom instead of grieving his father. "Let's discuss the inheritance," he announced with all the emotion of reading a grocery list. "The estate consists of 100 acres and a farmhouse. As Grandpa wanted, it will be divided fairly." My throat tightened. I hadn't expected anything, but hearing Dad talk about Grandpa's land like a business asset made my stomach turn. Dad slid papers across the table to me. "Sign here, son. I'll handle everything. We're family, after all." My eyes scanned the document, but legal jargon swam before me. I caught phrases about equal acreage division and property transfer. From what I could piece together, Dad and Zach would get the house and 50 acres, while I would get 50 acres plus the old trailer Grandpa used as his music room. I hesitated, pen hovering above the signature line. Something felt off, but I couldn't place what exactly. The documents were complex, and I couldn't tell which 50 acres would be mine. "Don't worry about the details," Dad said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. "Everything's fair, just as Grandpa wanted." Across the table, Zach smirked. "You're getting Grandpa's guitar too, don't worry." I signed, feeling a coldness spread through my chest. The pen felt heavier than it should have. "I'll file these tomorrow," Dad said, collecting the papers with a practice sweep. "The property transfer should be completed within a week." That week passed in a blur of odd jobs and late-night gigs at dive bars. I'd moved to New Orleans years ago, tried to make it as a musician, but success remained as elusive as catching fireflies in a hurricane. My apartment was barely bigger than a shoebox, with walls thin enough to hear my neighbor's dreams. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, not from Dad, but from his colleague, the same slick-haired man from the funeral. "Jake, this is Martin Boudreau, your father's associate. I'm calling about your grandfather's estate." "Congratulations," the voice continued with professional detachment. "The transfer property has been completed. You now own the southwestern 50 acres and the trailer, as per the agreement you signed." My grip tightened on the phone. "Which part exactly? Can you send me a map?" "The paperwork has been filed with the county clerk's office," he replied. "You can get all the details there. The property transfer is complete and legally binding." The room seemed to tilt sideways. Something didn't feel right. Why the southwestern portion specifically? Why was this lawyer calling instead of my own father? "Is there anything else I should know?" I asked, suspicion creeping into my voice. "I'm not at liberty to discuss any further details," Martin replied coolly. "The paperwork has been filed. Good day, Mr. Thibodeau." The line went dead before I could say another word. My hands shaking, I immediately called the county assessor's office, then a local real estate agent I knew from high school. It took just 2 phone calls to uncover the ugly truth. The developable land my father and brother got was worth 4 times what my swamp acres were valued at. The northern portion was already zoned for commercial development, while my section was protected wetlands that couldn't be built on. Dad had known all along. He'd played me like a fiddle at a country dance. My fist connected with the wall before I realized what I was doing. Pain shot through my knuckles, but it didn't touch the betrayal burning in my chest. "You son of a..." I started, but there was no one to hear me. I stood in my tiny kitchen, phone dangling from my hand, as Grandpa George's words echoed in my head. "When a lawyer smiles at you, hide your heart." 50 acres of worthless swamp, a rotting trailer, and the bitter taste of family betrayal. I slumped against the wall, sliding down until I hit the floor. Outside my window, the New Orleans evening was coming alive with music and laughter, but inside, all I could hear was my father's distant laugh and the phantom strumming of Grandpa's old guitar. He'd known all along. Dad was so slick that alligators probably asked him for autographs, and I'd walked right into it, trusting family when I should have checked their pockets. The photograph of Grandpa George stared back at me from where it had fallen. His eyes seemed to hold a secret now, something I'd missed all those years listening to stories about old legends and hidden treasures. "What were you trying to tell me, Grandpa?" I whispered to the empty room. The record player had stopped, leaving nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and distant traffic. 50 acres of swamp. What the hell was I supposed to do with that? 2 days after discovering my father's betrayal, I found myself standing at the edge of my inheritance, with mud already seeping into my sneakers. 50 acres of Louisiana swampland stretched before me like some cosmic joke. The air hung thick with humidity and the smell of decay, while mosquitoes performed their aerial assault with military precision. In the distance, I could make out the silhouette of Grandpa's old trailer, listing slightly to one side like a drunk trying to maintain dignity. "This is inheritance," I muttered, swatting at something that felt less like a mosquito and more like a tiny vampire. "This is punishment. I took a step forward and immediately sank ankle-deep into muck that made a sound like someone slurping the last dregs of a milkshake. Perfect. Just perfect. The property line was marked by faded wooden stakes that looked about as sturdy as wet newspaper. Beyond them was a good land, my father and brother's portion, already being surveyed by men in hard hats with expensive equipment. One of them noticed me watching and nudged his colleague. They both laughed. The trailer wasn't just old. It was a museum exhibit for neglect. The metal siding had rusted in patches, creating a camouflage pattern that wasn't fooling anyone. The 3 concrete blocks that served as steps wobbled dangerously as I climbed them. The door creaked open with the dramatic flair of a horror movie, revealing an interior that smelled like mothballs, stale tobacco, and lost dreams. A sagging couch faced a TV from the Reagan era. The kitchenette's linoleum floor was peeling up at the corners, like it was trying to escape. And the roof. Well, the collection of pots and pans on the floor suggested the roof had given up its primary function of keeping water outside. Home, sweet home, I said to the spider building a web between the sink faucet and a mug with a faded LSU logo. I dropped my duffel bag on the floor, sending up a small cloud of dust. Grandpa's old guitar case was propped in the corner, right where I remember it always being when he'd retreat here to play. At least Dad had left that. The rage that had been simmering inside me for days finally boiled over. I pulled out my phone and dialed my father's number. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice carrying that well-practiced tone of someone who believes they're always the smartest person in any conversation. "Jake, I was wondering when you'd call. Settled into your new place." The casual audacity nearly choked me. "Swamp planned? This was your plan all along? To dump me in a mosquito breeding ground while you and Zach cash in?" There was a pause, and I could practically hear him adjusting his tie. It's an equal division of acreage, just as Grandpa wanted. Not my fault the market values certain parcels differently. In the background, I heard Zach's voice. "Tell him to start a frog farm." My father chuckled. "Look, Jake, it's just business. Family business. You signed the papers. Because you lied to me. You said it was all fair. And legally it is 50 acres each. Fair and square." His voice took on that lawyerly tone he used in court. "Maybe try seeing the opportunity here instead of complaining. Your grandfather always said that land had something special about it." "Yeah, malaria." I snapped back, Zach's voice again. "Maybe the mosquitoes will adopt him." Their shared laughter was the last straw. I hurled my phone at the wall with enough force to shatter the screen, sending plastic shrapnel across the dusty floor. The spider in the sink paused its web construction, seemingly judging my anger management skills. "Sorry," I told it. "Rent's free if you kill mosquitoes." The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in life's downward spiral. I'd been working at a jazz bar in the French Quarter, mixing drinks, and occasionally playing guitar during breaks. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep my New Orleans apartment and still eat something other than ramen noodles. But showing up late 3 days in a row after driving back and forth to deal with my inheritance didn't sit well with the manager. Neither did looking too sad while making espresso, apparently a cardinal sin in the service industry. "Customers come here for good times, Jake, not to watch you sulk over coffee beans," my boss said as he handed me my final paycheck. With rent due and my bank account flatlining faster than a patient in a medical drama, I made the only logical choice available. I packed up my meager belongings and moved into Grandpa's trailer. At least it was free, even if the roommates were primarily 8-legged. Days blended together in a haze of budget peanut butter sandwiches and Zydeco records I'd found in a box under Grandpa's bed. I'd sit on the rickety porch at sunset, watching the swamp transform from a muddy hellscape to something almost mysterious as fireflies sparked like distant stars and frogs performed their nightly symphony. But magic doesn't pay bills, and my remaining cash was disappearing faster than ice in August. Something had to change. On a particularly desperate Tuesday, I drove into the nearest town, a one-stoplight affair where the most exciting establishment was a gas station that also sold fishing bait and lottery tickets. But they did have a coffee shop called Gator Brew, which sounded just depressing enough to match my mood. The place smelled like beignet and regret. with an accordion player in the corner performing the saddest rendition of jambalaya I'd ever heard. A group of old-timers argued about catfish bait by the window, while a barista looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. I ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu and turned to quickly, slamming straight into someone and sending my drink splashing across both of us. Jesus Christ on a fan boat! A woman's voice exclaimed as hot coffee soaked through her white shirt. I'm so sorry, I stammered, grabbing napkins from the counter. I didn't see you and... She looked up, and I forgot what I was saying. She had the kind of eyes that change color depending on the light. Curly somewhere between green and gold, and short dark hair that curled against her neck. But it was her expression, more amused and angry, that caught me off guard. You smell like swamp, dude, she said, dabbing at her shirt. Her accent was pure Louisiana Bayou, thick as gumbo and twice as rich. I live in one, I admitted, feeling heat rise to my face that had nothing to do with the spilled coffee. She raised an eyebrow. On purpose? That made me laugh for the first time in weeks. Not exactly. Inheritance gone wrong. 50 acres of prime mosquito real estate and a trailer that's mostly held together by spider webs and regret. Something changed in her expression. A spark of interest. 50 acres? Where exactly? I described the location, and her eyes widened slightly. That's Thibodeau land, she said. South of the old Cypress Grove? I nodded, surprised. How'd you know? She stuck out her hand. Hannah Bro. I'm an entomologist, bug scientist, she clarified, probably seeing my blank expression. I've been surveying wetland insect populations in this parish for the last 6 months. I shook her hand, noticing calluses that spoke of field work rather than lab work. Jake Thibodeau, failed musician and reluctant swamp owner. Her smile had a mischievous quality that reminded me of the way sunlight dances on water. Failed musician, huh? That explains the dramatic coffee entrance. We ended up sharing a table, and I learned Hannah wasn't just any entomologist. She'd walked away from a prestigious research position in Chicago to return to Louisiana. Something about her accent got thicker when she talked about the wetlands, like her voice was coming home too. Most people look at swamps and see nothing but mud and mosquitoes, she said, gesturing with hands that never seemed to stop moving. But there's some of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. Every inch is teeming with life. I snorted. Yeah, life that wants to drain my blood or give me a rash. Hannah rolled her eyes. City boy. Born and raised right here, actually. I corrected her, just smart enough to leave. And yet here you are again. Her smile softened the jab. So what's your plan for the land? I shrugged. Sell it. If anyone's dumb enough to buy it. Otherwise, I guess I'll just slowly transform into a fraud person. Hannah leaned forward suddenly, her coffee forgotten. What if I told you that swampland of yours might be worth more than you think? I laughed. I'd ask what you've been smoking, and if you'd share. Her eyes narrowed with determination. You mentioned Thibodeau. Was George your grandfather? The question caught me off guard. Yeah, you knew him. Of him, she corrected. I was doing research on historical land surveys when his name came up. That area has some unique characteristics. The water chemistry, the plant life. She trailed off, then looked at me with renewed intensity. Have you noticed anything unusual out there? Sounds? Insects. I thought about the mosquitoes that seemed big enough to carry off small children. Just the usual swamp stuff. Why? Hannah took a deep breath. There have been rumors for years about rare species in that particular stretch of wetland, including, she lowered her voice, Melipona obscura, black bees. Bees! I repeated, convinced she was messing with me. In a swamp? Not just any bees, she insisted, her eyes gleaming with excitement. These are practically mythical in entomology circles. They're supposedly extinct in Louisiana, but there have been unconfirmed sightings in isolated wetland areas. They produce a honey with medicinal properties that's worth more per ounce than some premium whiskeys. I looked at her skeptically. So my swamp is secretly a gold mine because of magic bees that probably don't exist? Hannah didn't seem discouraged by my skepticism. Those worthless wetlands you inherited? They might be perfect Black Bayou habitat. The right flora, the right conditions. She tapped her fingers against the table rhythmically. Look, I've been trying to get research access to private wetlands in this area for months. Would you let me take a look around your property? I raised an eyebrow. You want to trudge through mud and get eaten alive by mosquitoes for fun? For science, she corrected, grinning. And because I think your grandfather might have known something about those wetlands that your father doesn't. The mention of my father made my jaw clench. The idea that he might have missed something valuable when screwing me over was admittedly appealing. What's in it for me? I asked, trying to sound casual rather than desperate. Hannah shrugged. I'll bring lunch and bug spray. And if I find anything interesting, you'll be the first to know. What have you got to lose? My remaining dignity and possibly several pints of blood to mosquitoes. She laughed. Trust me, I know how to handle swamp critters. One day, that's all I'm asking. I should have said no. Every reasonable part of my brain was screaming that chasing fairy tales about magic bees was exactly the kind of dreamer nonsense my father always ridiculed me for. But there was something about Hannah. Her confidence, her enthusiasm, or maybe just the fact that she was the first person in weeks who'd talk to me like I might not be a complete loser. Fine, I sighed. One day. But when all we find is mud and mosquitoes, you owe me another coffee. Her smile was bright enough to light up the entire cafe. Deal. Tomorrow morning, I'll bring everything we need. That night, I sat on the trailer steps watching darkness settle over the swamp. The usual evening noises surrounded me. Frogs, crickets, the occasional splash of something moving in the water. In the distance, lightning bugs pulse like distant Morse code. Grandpa used to sit right here. I realized this was his spot. I tried to see the swamp through his eyes, to understand what he might have valued in this sodden, inhospitable place. What were you thinking, old man? I whispered to the darkness. Why this place? I was about to head inside when I heard it. A sound different from the usual swamp chorus. Not frogs, not insects, not birds. A low, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from the depths of the property, barely audible but distinct. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before fading away. I stood frozen, straining to hear it again. Nothing came except the normal nighttime sounds. What the hell was that? I murmured, peering into the darkness. For the first time since arriving, I felt a flicker of curiosity about this place. Maybe Hannah wasn't completely crazy. Maybe there was something here after all. What did you hide out here, Grandpa? I whispered, as the strange humming briefly returned before disappearing again into the night. Hannah arrived at my trailer the next morning, driving an ancient Jeep Wrangler caked with so much mud it looked like a mobile archaeology exhibit. She hopped out wearing cargo pants, hiking boots, and a faded LSU cap, carrying a backpack that seemed ready for a week-long expedition rather than a day trip. "Morning, Swamp King," she called, way too cheerful for 7 a.m. "Ready for our adventure?" I grunted something unintelligible and took a swig of coffee from my thermos. Morning has never been my natural habitat. "I brought supplies," Hannah announced, unloading gear from her Jeep. "Waders, bug spray with DEET levels that probably violate several environmental regulations, first aid kit, water, lunch, and everything we need to collect samples." I eyed the pile skeptically. "What? No flamethrower for the giant mosquitoes." She tossed me a pair of knee-high rubber boots. "City boys get the most basic gear. Earn your swamp cred, then we'll talk flamethrowers." The morning air hung heavy with mist rising from the water, giving the swamp an otherworldly quality I hadn't noticed before. Sunlight filtered through cypress trees draped with Spanish moss, creating dappled patterns on the murky water. The smell was a strange mix of earthy decay and sweet magnolia blossoms. Hannah moved through the terrain with practiced ease, occasionally stopping to examine plants or collect water samples in little vials. Meanwhile, I stumbled along behind her, already sweating through my shirt and slapping at insects. "If there are bees out here," I grumbled, "they're probably playing poker with alligators and betting on how long I'll last before passing out from heat stroke." Hannah paused to examine something on a rotting log. You know, your grandfather used to tell people this swamp had secrets. That caught my attention. You talked to my grandpa? No, but people around here remember him. Old-timers at the bait shop say he'd come back from these wetlands with stories. And honey, especially after storms when the water was high. I frowned. If there was anything valuable here, my father would have known. Hannah shot me a look. Some things are valuable only if you know what you're looking for. We had been hiking for nearly 2 hours, with Hannah taking soil samples and documenting plant species on a waterproof tablet. The deeper we ventured, the more the terrain changed. The water became clearer in patches, and wildflowers I'd never seen bloomed along the edges of small islands. "This is odd," Hannah said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "This microecosystem shouldn't be here. These plants usually don't grow together, but they're thriving." I was about to ask why that mattered when I heard it, a low, unsettling sound of something large moving through water. The noise came again, closer this time, a splash followed by the crunch of vegetation. Hannah froze, holding up her hand for me to be silent. We both turned slowly toward the sound. There, not 20 feet away, a massive alligator was emerging from the water, its prehistoric eyes fixed on us with the detached interest of an apex predator assessing whether we'd make a decent meal. "Don't move," Hannah whispered. Naturally, I took that as my cue to start backing away. "Run," I hissed. To my absolute horror, Hannah didn't run. Instead, she reached down and picked up a long stick, facing the alligator like she was about to challenge it to a duel. The gator, easily 12 feet long, opened its mouth in a lazy display of teeth that could snap a canoe in half. "They usually avoid humans," Hannah said calmly, as if giving a nature tour. "He's probably just curious. Curious about how I taste with hot sauce," I whispered back. The alligator took another step forward. I was calculating my odds of reaching a climbable tree when Hannah suddenly raised her stick and slapped it hard against the water, creating a loud splash. Then she made herself look bigger by raising her arms and gave a sharp, loud hiss. To my amazement, the gator paused, seemed to reconsider its life choices, and slowly sank back into the water, disappearing beneath the surface. Hannah turned to me with a grin. "See? Just needed a reminder that we're not worth the trouble." I stared at her in disbelief. "Where exactly did you learn to speak alligator?" "My uncle's an alligator wrangler," she said with a shrug. "In Louisiana, that's practically a requirement for family reunions." My heart was still racing. That thing looked at me like I was a hamburger with legs. Hannah laughed. "Nah, more like a chicken tender. Not quite enough meat for a full meal." "Comforting," I muttered, but found myself smiling despite the lingering terror. "Come on," she said, pointing to a rise of land ahead. "That cypress stand looks promising." The stand of ancient cypress trees created a natural cathedral, their massive trunks rising from the water like columns. At the center was a patriarch, an enormous oak that somehow found purchase on a small island. Its sprawling branches created a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a dapple gold. Hannah approached the tree with something like reverence. "This is perfect habitat," she whispered, examining the trunk and branches. "If black bees are anywhere in the swamp, they'd be—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes fixed on something high in the branches. "Jake," she breathed, pointing upward. "Look." I followed her gaze and saw what looked like a dark mass nestled between two large branches about 15 feet up. "Is that—" I started. "A wild hive," Hannah confirmed, her voice trembling with excitement. "And not honeybees or wasps." She pulled out binoculars from her pack and studied the hive, then handed them to me. Through the lenses, I could see small black insects moving in and out of a crevice in the trunk. "How do we know they're your magic bees and not just regular bees with a fashion preference for black?" I asked. "We need to get closer," Hannah said, already assessing the tree for a climbing route. "Whoa, wait a minute," I protested. "We just escaped death by a gator. Are we really looking to get attacked by potentially mythical bees next?" Hannah unpacked what looked like specialized climbing gear from her backpack. Of course she'd come prepared for tree climbing. These bees aren't aggressive unless threatened, she explained, securing a harness around her waist. I just need a small sample and maybe a bit of honey if we're lucky. I watched nervously as Hannah scaled a tree with surprising agility. She moved carefully, stopping frequently to catch her breath and communicate with me through hand signals that I pretended to understand. When she reached a branch near the hive, she slowly removed small tools from a pouch at her belt. "They're definitely Melipona obscura," she called down, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "The coloration, the hive structure, it's them." Part of me wanted to share her enthusiasm, but I was too busy scanning for the return of our reptilian friend. What happened next unfolded with the chaotic precision of a slapstick comedy. Hannah carefully extracted a small section of honeycomb, placing it in a collection jar. The bees, apparently less docile than advertised, began to swarm around her. She lost her balance. The jar tumbled from her hands, and I lunged to catch it, forgetting I was standing in 6 inches of swamp water. My feet slipped on the muddy bottom, sending me sprawling backward just as Hannah dropped from the lower branch. She landed half on top of me, and we both went down in a splash of muddy water and tangled limbs. And that's when I felt the sting, sharp and hot on my forearm. "Son of a—" I yelped, scrambling to my feet and swatting at my arm. "Don't!" Hannah grabbed my wrist. "Let me see." A single black bee was still attached to my skin, its stinger embedded. Hannah gently brushed it away and immediately applied something from a small kit in her pocket. "That's going to hurt like hell for about 10 minutes, she said apologetically. Then the venom actually becomes a mild analgesic. These aren't like regular honeybees. The pain was intense, like someone had jabbed me with a hot needle. "These aren't bees," I gasped. "They're tiny helicopters with attitude problems." Hannah carefully gathered the honeycomb sample that had miraculously landed on a patch of dry ground during our tumble. The dark amber honey dripped slowly, catching the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. "Smell it," she urged, holding the sample close to my face. Despite the throbbing in my arm, I leaned in and inhaled. The aroma was unlike any honey I'd encountered. Complex notes of wildflowers mingled with something almost medicinal, plus hints of citrus and spice that seemed impossible from swamp vegetation. "Holy shit," I whispered. "Exactly," Hannah grinned. "This is the real deal." Clouds gathered as we made our way back, darkening the sky and bringing the promise of one of Louisiana's infamous afternoon thunderstorms. By the time we reached the ancient oak, fat raindrops were already pattering through canopy. "We should wait it out," Hannah suggested, pointing to the relative shelter beneath the oak's massive branches. "These storms usually blow over quick." We huddled under the tree as the rain intensified, turning the swamp into a symphony of sounds. Water drumming on leaves, frogs singing their approval, distant thunder rolling across the sky. Hannah sat beside me on a relatively dry tree root, our shoulders touching. She reached over and gently wiped a smudge of mud from my cheek, her fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary. "You're not as hopeless as you look," she teased, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "And you're definitely as crazy as you seem," I replied, suddenly aware of how close we were sitting and how her eyes caught the dim light filtering through the leaves. Something shifted between us in that moment, a spark of connection that had nothing to do with bees or swamps and everything to do with two people finding each other in the least likely of places. The rain eased after 20 minutes, leaving the swamp glistening and vibrant. We continued our journey back, with me carrying our precious cargo, 3 small jars of the Black Bayou Honey, and several specimen vials containing bees that had unfortunately met their end during our adventure. That's when disaster struck in the form of my own clumsiness. A particularly aggressive swarm of mosquitoes descended on us, and in my frantic waving and swatting, I lost my grip on the backpack. One of the honey jars tumbled out, breaking against a cypress knee and spilling half its golden contents into the swamp water. "No!" I lunged for it, only managing to cover myself in more mud. Hannah's reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of frustration, she burst into laughter. Deep, genuine belly laughs that echoed through the trees. "Congratulations," she wheezed between fits of giggles. "You're now officially the Swamp King, anointed with mud and precious honey." I looked down at my mud-covered clothes and honey-splattered hands, and something inside me broke loose. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I laughed, really laughed, until tears streamed down my face and my sides ached. My royal subjects include 3 angry alligators and approximately 50 million mosquitoes, I gasped. Back at the trailer, we cleaned up as best we could with my limited water supply. Hannah carefully packed the remaining honey samples and bee specimens into a cooler in her Jeep. I need to get these to the university lab, she explained. I have access to testing equipment after hours. Want to come see what makes this honey special. Part of me wanted nothing more than to collapse on my sagging couch and not move for several days. But a larger part was genuinely curious, both about the honey and about spending more time with Hannah. Will there be fewer things trying to eat or sting me in this lab? I asked. She grinned. Probably. No guarantees, though. The university lab was all gleaming surfaces and expensive-looking equipment, a stark contrast to the primal chaos of the swamp. Hannah moved through it with confidence, setting up tests and prepping slides while explaining the process in terms simple enough for even my mud-addled brain to grasp. This honey has compounds you don't find in commercial varieties, she explained, pointing to peaks on a computer screen that meant nothing to me but had her practically bouncing with excitement. Significantly higher antioxidant levels, unique flavonoid profiles, and several compounds I can't even identify yet. And that's good. I ventured. Jake, specialty honey markets are already a thing. Manuka honey from New Zealand sells for up to $500 per jar because of its medicinal properties. She tapped the screen. Based on these preliminary tests, your Black Bee honey might be in the same league or better. The room seemed to tilt slightly as the implications sank in. You're saying my worthless swamp is actually worth something? Hannah nodded. The real value is in the bees themselves. This could be the only established black bee colony in Louisiana. Do you understand how significant that is from a conservation standpoint? And commercially? I thought honey was just honey. I admitted. This isn't just honey, Hannah said, her eyes bright with excitement. This is liquid gold. It's your golden ticket. I snorted. I always thought golden tickets were things you found in chocolate bars that got you into weird factories with singing little people. Hannah rolled her eyes. You're hopeless. But luckily for you, I know people who might be interested in this. The next day, we returned to the swamp, this time better prepared. Hannah brought proper beekeeping gear, and we carefully collected more honeycomb from the black bee hive, making sure to take only what wouldn't harm the colony. I managed to avoid both falling into the mud and getting stung, which I considered a major personal victory. 2 days later, we were setting up a small table at the weekend farmers market in town. Hannah had helped me bottle and label our harvest into 10 small jars with handwritten tags reading Black Bayou Honey, limited harvest. Nobody's going to buy this, I muttered as we arranged the display. We look like we made this in a bathtub. Trust me, Hannah said, arranging wildflowers around the jars to create a more appealing presentation. People love artisanal, small batch products. And once they taste it, to my amazement, she was right. The first curious customer, a woman in her 50s with a wide-brimmed hat, took one taste of the sample we offered and immediately bought 2 jars. By midday, we had sold 7 jars at $25 each, a price Hannah had insisted wasn't too high. Our final customer of the day turned out to be a game changer. A tall man in a crisp white shirt approached our humble table, introduced himself as a head chef at a high-end restaurant in the French Quarter, and asked about our honey source. Hannah smoothly explained the unique properties of black bee honey, while I stood there trying not to look like I'd spent the previous day face-planting in mud. The chef tasted a sample, and his eyebrows shot up. This is extraordinary, he said. The complexity, the finish, I'd like to feature this in our fall menu. Could you provide a steady supply? Say 20 jars per month to start. Hannah glanced at me, and I somehow managed to find my voice. We're still developing our production capacity, but we could certainly work towards that volume. The chef nodded approvingly, handed us his business card, and placed an immediate order for our remaining 3 jars. As we packed up our empty table, a sense of disbelief washed over me. We made nearly $250 from honey that yesterday had been sitting in a tree in my worthless swamp. I looked up at the evening sky, thinking about Grandpa George and his mysterious hints about the swamp's value. You saw this coming, didn't you, old man? I whispered. Hannah loaded the last item into her Jeep and turned to me with a smile that held equal parts triumph and possibility. So, she asked, ready to become a beekeeper? The chef's order was just the beginning. Within a month of our farmer's market debut, Black Bayou Honey became something of a local sensation. What started as a desperate attempt to find value in my worthless inheritance was quickly turning into an actual business, one that required paperwork, planning, and all those adult things I've been avoiding since college. Fortunately, Sheriff Earl turned out to be as good with bureaucracy as he was with fishing tales. He showed up at the trailer one morning with coffee, beignet, and a stack of forms. Heard you're becoming a honey mogul, he said, settling his bulk onto my rickety porch chair with the caution of someone who'd seen too many collapse. Thought you might need some help navigating the red tape. Earl had been handling the parish's permits and licenses for 30 years. He knew which forms needed filing, which officials needed polite phone calls, and which regulations could make or break a small business. Bees versus lawyers? Earl chuckled as we worked through the paperwork. My money's on the bees every time. With Hannah's expertise and my growing knowledge of the swamp, we mapped out the property to identify potential locations for additional hives. The black bees had specific habitat requirements. They needed certain flowering plants, access to clean water, and protection from wind and extreme temperatures. These aren't your standard European honeybees, Hannah explained one evening as we pored over maps spread across my kitchen table. They're native, adapted to the specific ecosystem. That's why they survived here when they disappeared everywhere else. I nodded as if I completely understood the ecological significance, when really I was just thinking how the lamplight caught the amber highlights in her hair. Building proper hives required expertise we didn't have, so Hannah introduced me to Remy Thibodeau, no relation. Despite the shared surname, half of Louisiana seems to be named Thibodeau or Boudreaux. Remy was a 60-something carpenter with hands like weathered oak and a Cajun accent so thick it qualified as its own dialect. Dem black bees, dey picky, he informed me while measuring lumber for the specialized hives. Need the right wood, right size. He worked with meticulous precision, occasionally breaking into Zydeco songs that seemed to involve a lost love, a stolen pirogue, and possibly a vengeful crawfish. While we waited for the hives to be built, Hannah and I carefully harvested more honey from the existing wild colony, always making sure to leave plenty for the bees themselves. We bottled the honey in small glass jars I found at a restaurant supply store in New Orleans, creating hand-printed labels with an image of the swamp at sunset. Each weekend, we sold out at the farmer's market, gradually increasing our prices as demand grew. Local shops began asking to carry our product, and the chef from the French Quarter introduced our honey to his foodie network. Your grandfather would be mighty proud, Earl commented one day as he helped us load jars into Hannah's Jeep. He always said that swamp had a future. 3 months into our beekeeping adventure, something unexpected happened. A food blogger from New Orleans came to do a feature on local artisanal products and spotlighted our honey with a video showing Hannah, explaining the unique properties of black bee honey, while I awkwardly demonstrated how to drizzle it over fresh biscuits. Neither of us expected much from it. Local blogger, local audience, right? Wrong. The video went viral, racking up 1 million views in a week. Suddenly our email inbox was flooded with requests from across the country. Our voicemail filled up. The farmer's market booth became a mob scene. "This is insane," I said one night, packing honey jars until my fingers cramped. It was 11 p.m., and we still had dozens of orders to fulfill. A month ago I was unemployed and living in a leaky trailer. Now I'm running out of product because too many people want to give me money. Hannah looked up from the shipping labels she was printing on a second-hand laptop. "Welcome to the American dream, swamp style." I snorted. If this is the American dream, why am I still eating ramen for dinner? "Because you're reinvesting in the business," she said with a grin, like a proper capitalist. The real game changer came in the form of an email from a cosmetics company based in Atlanta. They specialize in natural skincare products and wanted to incorporate our unique honey into a new premium line. Their initial offer, $150,000 for exclusive rights to use Black Bayou Honey in their products, nearly made me fall off my chair. Is this for real? I asked Hannah, who was reading the email over my shoulder. It's legitimate, she confirmed after researching the company. They're well-established, ethical, and their ingredient sourcing is actually transparent. This could be huge, Jake. After a flurry of calls, emails, and a video conference where I tried to look like I knew what I was doing, we negotiated terms that will allow us to maintain our direct-to-consumer sales while supplying the cosmetics company with bulk honey for their products. The final contract included funding for expanding our operation and establishing proper facilities. When the signed paperwork came through, Hannah insisted we celebrate. We ended up at Gator Brew, the same coffee shop where we'd first met, though this time we stayed for their evening transformation into a local hangout with live jazz and cold beer. The band played a soulful rendition of Basin Street Blues, while locals two-stepped on the small dance floor. The air smelled of spicy boiled shrimp and fresh bread, with conversations flowing as freely as the drinks. In that moment, sitting across from Hannah in a booth made from reclaimed cypress, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. To Black Bayou Honey, Hannah said, raising her glass, and to swamps that aren't so worthless after all. To bees and second chances, I added, clinking my glass against hers. I was about to say something more, something about how she'd changed everything, when a familiar voice cut through the music. Well, look who's a businessman now. My father stood at our table, looking exactly as I remembered. Tailored suit, manicured nails, and that smile that never quite reached his eyes. Beside him, my brother Zach examined the bar like he was calculating how much it would cost to buy and tear down. Dad, I managed, my celebratory mood evaporating. What are you doing here? We've been hearing interesting things about Black Bayou Honey, he replied smoothly. Thought we should see what all the fuss is about. I made reluctant introductions. Hannah was polite but cool, assessing my family with the same analytical eye she used for insect specimens. Dad insisted on joining us, ordering top-shelf whiskey and interrogating us about the business with practiced casualness. Quite the operation you built, he finally said, swirling his drink. From what I hear, that cosmetics deal is substantial. Something in his tone set off warning bells. How did you hear about that? I asked. The deal had just been finalized that morning. Dad smiled. I keep my ear to the ground. Business sense runs in the family. After all, after the most uncomfortable hour of my life, Dad finally revealed his true purpose. As Hannah excused herself to use the restroom, his facade cracked just enough to show something I had rarely seen. Vulnerability. I need to explain about the land, he said, his voice lower, the practiced smoothness wavering. I was in debt, Jake. Bad investments, market crash. I needed that sale to the developers. Zach shifted uncomfortably. We didn't know there was anything valuable on that swamp. Listen, Dad continued, leaning forward. When I divided the property, I genuinely thought the swamp portion was worthless. Your grandfather's will wasn't specific about how to divide things. It just said to make sure everyone in the family was provided for. Dad leaned forward. But now that there is value there, we should talk about a family partnership. After all, if I hadn't given you that land, you'd never have discovered the bees. I stared at him, incredulous. Given me? You tricked me into taking the worthless part while you cashed in on the rest. Business, Dad countered. I taught you a valuable lesson. Zach wasn't as subtle. You've stolen our spotlight, he hissed. That honey business should be a family operation. Our family name, our land originally. We're on the verge of something big, Dad added. We can help take it national. Or, he let the word hang, we could contest how the property was divided. Find irregularities in the paperwork. My blood ran cold. It was a threat wrapped in an offer, delivered with a smile. We'll be in touch, Dad said, laying his business card on the table. Think about what's best for everyone. They left just as Hannah returned, her eyes questioning. I recounted the conversation, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger and anxiety. They want a piece of the business, or they'll sue. Hannah reached across the table and took my hand. Can they actually do that? Contest a land transfer? With Dad's legal connections? Maybe. He's not above creating problems, even if he can't win. The joy of our celebration had curdled into a knot of dread in my stomach. That night, unable to sleep, I sat in the trailer sorting through boxes of Grandpa's old belongings that I'd never properly unpacked. I needed some connection to him, some reminder of the man who believed in me when no one else had. In the corner leaned his old guitar, the one thing my father had made sure I received. I pulled it from its case, running my fingers over the worn frets where Grandpa's hands had formed countless chords. The instrument was badly out of tune, but even the discordant notes brought memories flooding back. Grandpa teaching me my first G chord, playing jambalaya together on the porch, him tucking handwritten songs into the guitar's case for me to find later. Wait, songs in the case. A memory surfaced. Grandpa showing me how he'd hide special notes and lyrics inside the guitar itself. A guitar holds more than music, Jake, he'd said with a wink. It holds secrets, too. I turned the instrument over, examining it closely. The neck joint had always been slightly loose, allowing access to the body cavity. Carefully, I loosened the strings and peered inside with my phone's flashlight. There, taped to the inner wall, was a small metal box I'd never noticed before. My hands trembled as I carefully extracted it. The box was old, about the size of a deck of cards, with a small envelope taped to the top, written in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting with the words, "For Jake, when you find the bees." When you find the bees. Not if, when. He'd known all along. Somehow, he'd known what was hiding in that swamp, and he'd known I would discover it eventually. I opened the envelope first, unfolding a letter written on yellowed paper. Jake, my boy, if you're reading this, you discovered what makes our swamp special. Those black bees have been our family's secret for generations, but the knowledge nearly died with my father. Your father never had the patience for bees or swamps. He wanted quick returns, not slow, sweet rewards. But you have the soul of a beekeeper. You understand that the most valuable things take time. I've included my official will in this box. I gave a copy to Earl for safekeeping, but I knew your father might try to find ways around it. That's why I'm leaving this copy directly to you, hidden where only you would find it. The will clearly states that the entire 100 acres belongs to you alone. Remember, Jake, your inheritance isn't the land or even the bees. It's what you choose to create from them. All my love, Grandpa George. My vision blurred with tears as I opened the metal box. Inside was a legal document, a properly notarized will dated just 2 months before Grandpa's death, clearly stating that the entire 100 acres was to go to me, with specific instructions about the Black Bee colony. There was even a note about how Grandpa suspected Tom might try to circumvent his wishes, which is why I filed an additional copy with the county clerk's office under seal, with instructions that it could only be accessed by Sheriff Earl or myself. The will was completely different from what my father had presented at the reading. He must have created a fake one, knowing I wouldn't question it in my grief. Attached to the will was a faded photograph I'd never seen before, a much younger Grandpa standing proudly next to several handmade beehives, with a small boy I recognized as myself sitting on his shoulders. We were both laughing, surrounded by the very swamp I'd initially despised. I sat on the floor of the trailer, documents spread around me, as the full weight of what Grandpa had done sank in. He hadn't just left me a piece of swampland. He'd left me his legacy, carefully preserved and protected until I was ready to discover it. He'd anticipated my father would try to cheat me. He prepared for it, creating a safety net I hadn't known existed. And somehow, he'd known I would eventually find my way back to the swamp and discover its secret. "You crafty old man," I whispered, wiping my eyes. "You saw it all coming." As dawn broke over the bayou, I called Hannah, my voice still thick with emotion. "You need to come over. There's something you have to see." While waiting for her to arrive, I called Sheriff Earl. Despite the early hour, he answered on the second ring. "Earl, I found Grandpa's real will in his guitar. There was a long pause before Earl sighed. So you found it. I was wondering when you might. You knew about this? I asked, trying to keep the accusation from my voice. George gave me a sealed envelope before he passed. Said if you ever came asking about land documents, I should give it to you, but only if you asked. Said you needed to find your own way first. He paused. I kept an eye on you, though. Made sure you didn't give up on that swamp too soon. Standing on the porch after the call, I watched the sunrise paint the swamp in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, I could hear that distinctive humming. The black bees starting their day's work, just as they had for generations before I ever knew they existed. The sound was different to me now. No longer mysterious or strange. It was a sound of inheritance, of legacy, of a path carefully laid by hands that had long since returned to the earth. You knew, Grandpa, I whispered to the morning air. Somehow you knew. Behind me, the guitar lay on the table, its secrets finally revealed. And outside, the bees continued their ancient song, a sound like promise. 6 months after finding Grandpa's will, Hannah and I stood nervously backstage at the New Orleans Food and Agriculture Expo. Outside, hundreds of industry professionals, food bloggers, and specialty retailers milled around booths showcasing everything from artisanal cheeses to craft whiskeys. Our Black Bayou Honey display was positioned in the premium section, looking far more professional than our humble beginnings at the farmer's market. I think I might throw up, I whispered to Hannah as we prepared for our presentation. She squeezed my hand. Remember how you faced down that alligator? You faced down the alligator. I was calculating how fast I could climb a tree. Still, she nudged me with her shoulder. If you can survive swamp predators, you can handle a room full of foodies with expense accounts. This was our big moment. Following the cosmetics deal, we'd invested in proper packaging, marketing materials, and expanded production. Earl had connected us with a local business advisor who helped us navigate growth without losing our soul in the process. The announcer called our names, and suddenly I was walking onto the stage with Hannah, blinking under the bright lights. The crowd, much larger than I'd expected, watched expectantly. My mouth went dry as I approached the microphone, but then I caught sight of our display. Jars of amber honey gleaming under spotlights, our logo featuring a stylized black bee against a backdrop of cypress trees. This was Grandpa's legacy. Our legacy now. The story of Black Bayou Honey, I began, my voice steady and I felt, starts with a worthless inheritance that turned out to be priceless. For the next 15 minutes, I told our story, the swamp, the discovery, the unique properties of our honey. Hannah explained the science behind the black bees and their medicinal honey, demonstrating sophisticated knowledge that had the academic types in the audience nodding appreciatively. We passed samples through the crowd, watching as people's expressions changed from polite interest to genuine surprise when they tasted our product. This isn't just honey, I concluded, holding up a jar so it caught the light. It's Louisiana heritage in a bottle, a legacy preserved by bees that were here before any of us, and will hopefully be here long after. The applause was thunderous. People stood, cheering and calling out questions. As we wrapped up the Q&A session, I noticed movement at the back of the room. My father and Zach were standing near the exit, watching proceedings with unreadable expressions. My stomach tightened. We hadn't spoken since their visit to Gator Brew, though their lawyer had sent a vaguely threatening letter regarding family interests in the business. Hannah followed my gaze and frowned. Don't let them ruin this moment, she said quietly. This is your victory. But as we left the stage, it became clear that confrontation was inevitable. Dad and Zach intercepted us before we could return to our booth. Impressive presentation, Dad said, his smile not reaching his eyes. You've certainly built something here. Thanks, I replied cautiously. Didn't expect to see you here. Zach snorted. Wouldn't miss it. Our family name's all over this brand, after all. A small crowd of industry people hovered nearby, clearly interested in meeting us after the presentation. Dad noticed him too and smoothly steered us toward a quieter corner. We should talk, he said, his voice lower. Our lawyer has prepared some documents regarding our family's interest in this enterprise. From his breast pocket, He produced a folded set of papers. Given the way the property was divided, there are legitimate questions about ownership rights to resources on the land. We're prepared to be reasonable, but we expect fair compensation for our family's contribution. I looked at the documents, complex legal language about disputed boundaries and ancestral resource rights. Classic intimidation tactics, wrapped in legalese. I did this for our family, Dad said, his voice softening to a near whisper. Everything I've ever done was to secure our future. For a moment, I almost believed him. Mr. Thibodeau? A woman in a crisp suit approached, glancing uncertainly between me and my father. I'm with the State Agricultural Board. We were hoping to speak with you about your conservation efforts with the black bees. Of course, I said, not taking my eyes off my father. I'll be there in just a moment. As the woman stepped away, Dad pressed the papers toward me. We can make this easy, or we can make it messy. Your choice. Hannah's hand found mine, her grip tight and reassuring. Actually, I said, reaching into my own jacket pocket, I have some documents of my own you might want to see. I pulled out Grandpa's will, the real one, and a letter from our lawyer confirming its authenticity and legal standing. Sheriff Earl took this to the county clerk as soon as I found it. Turns out Grandpa anticipated you might try something like this. The blood drained from my father's face as he scanned the document. Zach looked over his shoulder, confusion turning to anger. This can't be legal, he sputtered. Where did you get this? Grandpa left it for me to find when I was ready. He knew the swamp had value. Value you couldn't see because you were too busy looking for quick profits. The weeks of anxiety and anger should have made this moment satisfying, but instead I just felt tired. He also knew you'd try to take it from me once you realized what you'd miss. You faked this, Zach accused, but his voice lacked conviction. 3 notaries and the county judge disagree, I replied calmly, as does the additional copy Grandpa filed with the county clerk's office under seal. You're welcome to challenge it in court, but our lawyer says you'll just be wasting your money. Dad stared at me with a mixture of shock and something else. Respect, maybe? It was an expression I'd never seen directed at me before. You outplayed me, he said finally, his voice quiet. I learned from the best. I replied, just not in the way you intended. A crowd was gathering for the next presentation, and we were starting to attract curious glances. Dad carefully folded Grandpa's will and handed it back to me. What now? He asked, and for once, the great Tom Thibodeau, lawyer extraordinaire, actually seemed at a loss. I'd rehearsed this moment in my head 100 times, imagining the satisfaction of watching them slink away defeated. But standing there, seeing my father suddenly look older and smaller than I remembered, I realized something Grandpa had tried to teach me long ago. Victories that leave others broken don't feel like victories at all. Now nothing, I said finally. You go your way, I go mine. The land and the business stay with me, as Grandpa intended. But I'm not going to sue you for money you made selling the other portion of the property, even though technically that land was mine too. Dad's eyes widened slightly in surprise. Grandpa didn't raise me to hold grudges. I continued. He raised me to build things, not tear them down. I glanced at Zach, who was staring at his expensive shoes. If you ever want to visit the swamp, just visit. Nothing more. You're welcome to. Those bees are our family's legacy, after all of our family. Hannah squeezed my hand again, a gesture of support that meant more than she could know. Dad cleared his throat. That's generous of you, Jake. It's not generosity, I replied. It's just letting go of what doesn't matter so I can focus on what does. As they turned to leave, Zach hesitated, then looked back at me. That honey really is something special, he said, the closest thing to a compliment he'd ever given me. Grandpa always said bees know things we don't, I replied. Turns out he was right. We watched them disappear into the crowd, and a weight I've been carrying since childhood seemed to lift from my shoulders. Hannah leaned her head against my arm. You okay? She asked softly. Yeah, I said, somewhat surprised to find it was true. I really am. The rest of the expo was a whirlwind of success. We signed distribution deals with specialty food retailers across the southern states. A high-end chef from California commissioned a custom honey blend for his restaurants. Our booth won Best New Product, complete with a ridiculous oversized check that Hannah insisted on carrying around for the rest of the day. By the time we packed up our display, exhaustion had set in, but it was the good kind, the bone-deep satisfaction of hard work rewarded. We should celebrate, Hannah said as we loaded the last box into her Jeep, now professionally wrapped with our Black Bayou Honey logo. I have just the place, I replied. The old oak tree where we'd first discovered the black bees looked different in the fading evening light, less mysterious, more like home. We spread a blanket beneath its branches, uncorked a bottle of champagne, and toasted our success as the swamp came alive with night sound around us. Did you ever imagine this? Hannah asked, gesturing at the swamp that had transformed from my prison to my purpose. 6 months ago, you hated this place. I leaned back against the trunk, considering. I think I just hated what it represented. Being stuck, being cheated, being less than. I never really saw it for what it was. And what is it? Hannah asked. It's possibilities, I said, watching fireflies begin their evening dance above the water. It's what happens when you stop fighting against where you are and start working with it instead. The twilight deepened around us, stars appearing overhead. In the distance, the humming of the bees had quieted as they settled in for the night. This sound that once seemed so alien to me now felt like the most natural music in the world. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small box I'd been carrying around for weeks, waiting for the right moment. I have something for you, I said, suddenly nervous in a way that facing down my father hadn't made me. To say thank you for, well, everything. Hannah opened the box to find a delicate gold pendant in the shape of a bee, its body formed from a small piece of amber. She lifted it with careful fingers, her eyes widening. It's beautiful, she whispered, turning it to catch the last light of day. I found someone who does custom jewelry in the French Quarter, I explained. The amber actually has traces of our honey in it. She smiled, holding it out to me. Help me put it on? As I fastened the clasp around her neck, my fingers brushing against her skin, I searched for the right words. You're my home hive, I said finally, the phrase awkward but heartfelt. I'd still be lost without you. Hannah turned to face me, the pendant gleaming against her collarbone. And you're my honey, she replied with that smile that had first caught me in the coffee shop. Sweet, but with enough character to be interesting. Under that ancient oak, with the swamp breathing around us and stars emerging overhead, we shared a kiss that tasted of champagne and possibility. The journey from bitterness to this moment hadn't been direct or easy, but maybe that's what made it valuable. As Hannah rested her head on my shoulder, the low hum of distant bees created a perfect soundtrack. Some things, it turns out, are worth the stings along the way. Grandpa would have liked you, I told her. He always said the right partner makes the hardest work feel worthwhile. She smiled against my shoulder. He sounded like a wise man. The wisest, I agreed, and the most sneaky. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye and the crawl of a lifetime, with the cosmetics partnership providing steady income and our direct sales growing steadily. Black Bayou Honey transformed from a local curiosity to a nationally recognized brand. We expanded thoughtfully, always keeping the bees and the swamp's ecosystem at the center of our decisions. Hannah's research on the black bees led to academic publications and conservation grants. We used the funding to purchase additional wetlands adjacent to our property, creating a protected corridor for the bees to expand naturally. The University of Louisiana established a research station on a small portion of our land, studying the unique ecosystem that had preserved these rare insects. Our production facility, a converted bar at the edge of the property, built with sustainable materials and powered by solar panels, employed 15 local people, including Remy's grandson, who turned out to have a natural gift for beekeeping. We developed specialized products beyond just honey, beeswax candles, skincare items, and educational materials about wetland conservation. The trailer, to everyone's surprise, remained my favorite place to sleep, though we'd renovated enough to keep the rain outside where it belonged. There was something about falling asleep to the sound of the swamp, and waking to the distant hum of bees that luxury couldn't replace. Hannah moved in 6 months after the expo, filling the space with scientific journals, wildflower arrangements, and the organized chaos of a brilliant mind. We married under the old oak tree a year later, with Earl officiating and the entire town turning out for a celebration that merged traditional Cajun revelry with honey-infused everything. International expansion came gradually. First Canada, then specialty stores in France and Japan, where our story resonated with consumers drawn to authentic products with heritage. Black Bayou Honey became synonymous with both luxury and conservation, our signature black and gold packaging recognizable in gourmet shops across continents. On the 5th anniversary of Grandpa's death, I sat on the porch of the newly built main house, rustic but comfortable, designed to blend with the landscape rather than dominate it, watching the sunset paint the swamp gold. We'd cleared the day's schedule for private remembrance, and the property was quiet except for night creatures beginning their evening chorus. Hannah joined me, passing a jar of our special reserve honey, harvested only from the original wild hive under the oak tree. 5 years, she mused, settling beside me. Think you knew all this would happen? I considered the question, watching dragonflies skim across the water's surface. Not the details, maybe, but the possibility? Yeah, I think he saw that when no one else did. The business had grown beyond anything I could have imagined, with annual revenues now reaching $10 million and distribution in 7 countries. Last month, a major international conglomerate had offered to buy us out for a sum that still didn't seem real. We declined, preferring to maintain control over the bees' destiny and the swamp's future. What had once been worthless land was now recognized as an ecological treasure, with our portion of the swamp designated as a protected sanctuary for the black bees and other rare species. You know what's funny? I said, as darkness settled around us. Dad actually called yesterday, said he was proud of what we built. Hannah raised an eyebrow. Did you believe him? I shrugged. Maybe. He sounded different, older. Said he finally understood what Grandpa had been trying to teach us all those years. I hadn't forgiven him entirely. Some cuts run too deep for that, but the sharp edges of resentment had softened over time. We'd never be close, but we could acknowledge each other across the distance. We sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared overhead, the amber honey in our jar catching their reflection. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate, the sound echoing across the water. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your father hadn't tricked you? Hannah asked, if you'd gotten the good land instead of the swamp? The question hit me like a revelation, a perspective I'd never considered. If Dad hadn't relegated me to the worthless swampland, I would never have discovered the bees, never met Hannah, never found my true inheritance. I guess some gifts come wrapped in disappointment, I said finally. Hannah leaned her head against my shoulder, the bee pendant still at her throat after all these years. Life is like honey, Jake. Sometimes sticky, sometimes sweet, but always worth the effort. I smiled, recognizing Grandpa's philosophical style. In my own words now, he liked that saying. As night fully claimed the swamp, the familiar humming of bees, our bees, drifted through the darkness like a lullaby. Not just a sound anymore, but a reminder. Sometimes the sweetest success comes from the places others thought worthless. We did it, Grandpa. I whispered the stars above. We really did it.